The air in the funeral home was thick with the scent of lilies and sorrow. It was a cloying, sweet smell that clung to the back of my throat, a perfume I knew would haunt me for years. Every breath felt like I was inhaling my grief, letting it fill my lungs until there was no room for anything else. My mother was gone. The thought was a simple, brutal fact, a four-word sentence that my mind refused to process. It felt like trying to solve an impossible equation. I stood there, a ghost in a black dress, accepting condolences from people whose faces blurred into a watercolor of pity. There, "I'm so sorry for your loss, and she was a wonderful woman," became a meaningless hum, the background noise to the silent scream trapped in my chest. My husband, Mark, stood beside me, a pillar of supposed strength. His hand was a constant, warm pressure on the small of my back. Every so often, he would lean in, his breath tickling my ear, and whisper, "You're doing great, honey?" Or, "Just a little while longer." I appreciated the gesture, I think. In the fog of those first few days after Mom's heart attack, his presence had been a tether to reality. He'd handled the arrangements, fielded the phone calls, and held me while I sobbed until I was empty. He was being the perfect, supportive husband. That's what everyone saw. That's what I saw, too. My younger sister, Clara, was on my other side, a more fragile version of myself. We had our mother's eyes, a detail people loved to point out. But today, hers were red-rimmed and puffy, while mine were stark and dry. I had cried all my tears in the sterile quiet of the hospital. Now I was just numb. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to be feeling everything I couldn't. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at her eyes periodically. I felt a pang of guilt for my own emotional desertion. Mom had always said, "You two are all you've got. Look after each other." I reached over and squeezed Clara's arm. She gave me a weak, watery smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The service itself passed in a blur. A pastor who barely knew my mother spoke of her kindness in generic, prepackaged phrases. Cousin read a poem. I remained standing, sitting, and kneeling on autopilot. Mark's hand never left my back. It was only later, at the small reception in the adjoining room, that the fog began to lift, replaced by something sharp and cold. The room was filled with the low murmur of conversation, the clinking of coffee cups, and the quiet sobs of my Aunt Mildred. I was trying to choke down a stale sandwich when I excused myself to get some water, needing a moment away from the sympathetic glances. I stood by the water cooler, my back to the room, and took a long, slow drink. The cold liquid was a shock to my system. When I turned around, my eyes scanned the room for Mark. I spotted him near the large bay window, talking to Clara. It was a normal sight, a husband comforting his sister-in-law. My sister, my husband, two of the most important people in my life, sharing a moment of grief. I felt a flicker of warmth. We would get through this, the three of us. But then I looked closer. Mark had his hand on Clara's arm, just above the elbow. He was leaning in, his head tilted. From across the room, I couldn't hear what he was saying, but the posture was intimate, conspiratorial. Clara was looking up at him through her lashes, a move I'd seen her use 100 times on unsuspecting bartenders and cute guys in coffee shops. A small, sad smile played on her lips, but it wasn't the same smile she'd given me earlier. This one had a different edge to it, a little bit of light, a little bit of life. I told myself I was imagining things. My mind was a raw, exposed nerve. Grief was a funhouse mirror, distorting every reflection into something monstrous. Of course, he was just comforting her. Of course, she was just grateful. But I couldn't look away. He said something else, and Clara laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, more of a breathless giggle that she quickly stifled behind her hand, her eyes darting around the room as if to see if anyone noticed. But I noticed. The sound cut through the somber hum of the room like a shard of glass. It was the most out-of-place sound I had ever heard. People don't giggle at a funeral, especially not their own mothers. Then I saw Mark's thumb begin to stroke the soft skin of her inner arm, up and down, a slow, deliberate caress. It was a gesture so private, so possessive, that the air left my lungs in a whoosh. It was the way he touched me in the quiet moments, when we were alone. My sandwich-filled stomach churned, and for a second, I thought I was going to be sick right there on the cheap floral carpet. The world narrowed to the two of them, framed by the window. The light from outside caught the dust motes dancing in the air between them, making it seem like they were in their own private snow globe, a secret world I was not a part of. He leaned in even closer, his lips almost brushing her ear. Her eyes fluttered shut for a brief, blissful second. And in that moment, in that sacred space meant to honor the woman who gave us both life, I didn't see two people mourning. I saw two people flirting. My blood ran cold. The numbness that had been my shield for 3 days was gone, burned away by a white-hot surge of what? Anger? Disgust? Betrayal? It was all of those things and something more, something uglier that I couldn't yet name. It was the horrifying realization that the pillar I'd been leaning on was rotten to the core. The tether that I thought was holding me to reality was actually a leash, held by a man who was stroking my sister's arm while my mother's body lay in a casket less than 50 feet away. Just then, my uncle clapped Mark on the shoulder, breaking the spell. Mark jumped back from Clara as if he'd been electrocuted. His hand dropped. Clara's expression snapped back into one of practiced sorrow. They looked over at me, their faces a perfect mask of innocence. But I had seen it. The image was seared onto the inside of my eyelids. A giggle, caress, a shared, secret smile. It was a crack in the foundation of my life, and I had the sickening feeling that the entire house was about to come crashing down. Leaving the funeral home felt like surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. I gasped for the cool evening air, but the scent of lilies followed us out, clinging to my clothes, my hair, a phantom limb of the day's suffocating grief. Mark's hand was back on my back, guiding me toward our car. Felt heavy now, proprietary. Each finger was a brand, and I had to fight the urge to shrug it off. Clara trailed behind us, her head bowed. She didn't look at me, not once. The drive home was only 20 minutes, but it stretched into an eternity. Mark drove. I sat in the passenger seat staring blankly out the window, and Clara was a silent presence in the back. The three of us were encased in a bubble of leather and glass, moving through a world that suddenly felt alien. The familiar streets of our town, the houses with their warm, glowing windows, the kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. It all seemed like a movie I was no longer a part of. My world had shrunk to the suffocating confines of this car, thick with unspoken words. Mark, ever the pragmatist, was the first to speak. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "The service was beautiful. Your mom would have loved the roses." I said nothing. I just watched the blur of sycamore trees fly past. The roses. I hadn't even noticed the roses. All I could see was his thumb stroking my sister's arm. "Are you okay, honey?" he asked, reaching over and placing his hand on my knee. I flinched. It was a small, involuntary movement, but it felt like a seismic jolt in the stillness of the car. He immediately withdrew his hand, placing it back on the steering wheel. "Sorry," he murmured. "Long day." "I'm fine," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just tired." It was the easiest lie. The truth was a wild, monstrous thing that I couldn't begin to articulate. How do you say, "I think I just watched the two people I love most in the world betray me next to our mother's casket"? How do you form those words? So I said nothing. My silence was a shield, but it was also a listening device. I was attuned to every shift of weight, every sigh, every rustle of clothing. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Clara was looking out her window, her reflection a pale, ghostly mask. Was she replaying the same moment I was? Was that a flicker of guilt in her eyes? Or was it just grief? Or worse, was she not thinking about it at all because for her it was nothing new? My mind was a projector stuck on a loop, playing that one horrific scene over and over. Clara, laughing that silvery, inappropriate laugh. Mark, leaning in, his expression soft and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in years. His thumb, making those slow, hypnotic circles on her skin. Each time I replayed it, a new, sickening detail would emerge. The way Clara's body had been angled toward his, a subtle invitation. The way Mark's eyes had crinkled at the corners, a genuine smile, not the tired, supportive one he'd been giving me all day. Was I insane? My mother had just died. My brain wasn't functioning properly. It was addled with grief, sleep-deprived, running on stale coffee and sympathy casseroles. It was entirely possible that I had misinterpreted a simple, innocent moment of comfort. That was the rational explanation. It was the explanation I desperately wanted to believe. My entire life, my entire sense of reality, depended on it being true. But my gut, that deep, primal instinct that had guided me through life, was screaming at me, told me that what I saw was real. It wasn't comfort. It was desire. It wasn't familial affection. It was a secret. With that terrifying certainty came the whispers. Little memories, previously innocuous, began to surface, tainted by my new suspicion. I remembered our 4th of July barbecue last summer. Mark and Clara had volunteered to be on a team for cornhole, and they'd been laughing and high-fiving, their private jokes excluding everyone else. At the time, I'd been happy to see them getting along so well. My husband and my sister, friends. It was what you wanted. Now, the memory felt different. Their easy camaraderie seemed less like friendship and more like a shared history I knew nothing about. And then there was the time, a few months ago, when I couldn't find my favorite gray sweater. I'd searched the whole house. A week later, Clara wore it to Sunday dinner. "Oh my God, this is yours?" she'd exclaimed, feigning surprise when I pointed it out. Mark must have dropped it in my car when he helped me move those boxes. "Sorry." She'd laughed, and I'd laughed with her. It was just a sweater. But now, had Mark given it to her? Had she worn it because it smelled like him? The thought was so vile, so intrusive, that I felt a wave of nausea. The car slowed as we turned onto our street. The silence had become a living entity, a 4th passenger in the car, breathing down our necks. As Mark pulled into the driveway, the headlights washed over the familiar facade of our home. It looked the same as it had when we left that morning. A sturdy brick colonial with dark green shutters. A place I had always associated with safety, with love. Tonight, it looked like a stranger's house. Mark killed the engine. The resulting silence was even more profound. For a long moment, nobody moved. "I'll help you inside," Mark said to me, his voice low. In the back, Clara finally stirred. "No, it's okay," she said, her voice small and tight. "I'll just grab a rideshare from here. I don't want to intrude." "Don't be silly," Mark said a little too quickly. "We'll take you home." "No, really," she insisted. "I need some air." Before either of us could argue, she opened her door and scrambled out of the car, pulling her phone from her purse. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said, not looking at me, her words directed at the space between us. And then she was gone, a hurried silhouette walking quickly down our driveway and disappearing into the darkness. Mark sighed, turning to me. "She's taking it hard." He tried to put his arm around me. This time, I didn't just flinch. I physically recoiled, pressing myself against the passenger door as if it were a shield. The hurt in his eyes was immediate and palpable. For a split second, I almost believed it was genuine. "Honey, what is it?" he asked, his voice laced with a confusion that felt expertly crafted. I shook my head, unable to speak. I got out of the car and walked toward the front door, fumbling for my keys. I was no longer just mourning my mother. I was standing on the precipice of a new, terrifying grief, mourning the potential death of everything I had ever thought was true. The house was dark, and the silence that awaited me inside felt less like peace and more like a tomb. The house was a mausoleum of our shared life. Every object seemed to mock me. The wedding photo on the mantelpiece, our two smiling faces pressed together, felt like a cruel joke. The pair of Mark's shoes kicked off by the door, the jacket he'd slung over a dining chair. They were artifacts from a life that, just hours ago, I thought was mine. He had tried to talk to me, following me from room to room with a worried frown etched on his face. He offered me tea. He offered me a warm blanket. He offered me platitudes about grief coming in waves. I waved them all away with a listless hand, eventually retreating to the den and closing the door, leaving him on the other side. I sank into the deep leather armchair, the one we bought on our 5th anniversary, and stared into the darkness. I didn't turn on a light. I wanted the room to be as black as my thoughts. My mind, now free from the immediate shock, had become a frantic archive, pulling dusty, forgotten files from the cabinets of my memory. The scene at the funeral had been the key, unlocking a wing of the library I never knew existed. And now, I was forced to walk its halls, looking at every exhibit under a harsh, fluorescent light. Started with the jokes. For years, Mark and Clara had a running gag about a terrible B-movie they'd once watched together when I was out with friends. It was their thing. Whenever a family conversation hit a lull, one of them would quote a cheesy line from Galactic Zombie Invasion, and they would dissolve into laughter while everyone else just smiled politely. I'd always felt a small sting of exclusion, the way you do when you're on the outside of a private joke. But I chalked it up to them just having a similar sense of humor. Now I saw it for what it was, a wall. A small, shimmering barrier they built around themselves, right in front of my eyes. Their shared laughter was a secret language, and I was just now beginning to understand the translation. Then, a more vivid memory surfaced, this one smelling of chlorine and sunscreen. It was 2 summers ago at my cousin's annual pool party. I was 8 months pregnant with a baby we would later lose, and I was sitting in the shade watching Mark and Clara in the pool. He was teaching her how to do a handstand in the water. I remembered it so clearly. His hands were on her hips, steadying her as she kicked her legs up. She'd come sputtering to the surface, laughing, her wet hair slicked back from her face. His hands had lingered on her waist. I saw it then, too. I remember thinking his placement was a little low, a little too familiar. But she was my sister, and he was my husband, and I was pregnant and hormonal and happy. So I'd looked away, taken a sip of my lemonade, and dismissed it. He's just being helpful. He's excited to be an uncle. He's treating her like the sister he never had. The excuses I had manufactured were so flimsy, so pathetic. Now, replaying the scene, I saw the truth. I saw the way his fingers had flexed against the sliver of bare skin between her bikini top and bottom. I saw the look in his eyes. Not brotherly, not helpful, but hungry. My mind jumped to a dinner conversation from last spring. Clara was complaining about a man she had been seeing, a perfectly nice guy who she found a little boring. I'd offered some sisterly advice, but Mark had become unusually agitated. Boring? Clara, you deserve someone who excites you, who challenges you, he'd said, his voice full of a strange, passionate intensity. This guy sounds like he wouldn't know how to appreciate a woman like you. I remember being taken aback by his ferocity. Wow, Mark, tell us how you really feel, I teased. He had just shrugged, his face flushing slightly. I just hate seeing guys take her for granted, he'd mumbled. At the time, it felt like fierce, protective brother-in-law loyalty. Now, it sounded like the bitter complaint of a jealous man. The evidence kept mounting, each memory another brick in the wall of their betrayal. Her 30th birthday last year. I had spent weeks planning a surprise party. Mark had been less than enthusiastic about the planning, but he'd insisted on handling her gift himself. I have the perfect idea, he'd said. It was a bottle of expensive, niche perfume, a scent with notes of gardenia and sandalwood. How did you even know about this brand? I'd asked, impressed. I read about it somewhere, he'd answered vaguely. Clara's ecstatic reaction to the gift had seemed genuine. But what if it wasn't a surprise at all? What if it was the scent she wore for him? The thought made my skin crawl. My own birthday had been 2 months later. He'd given me a gift card to a department store. And then, the most painful realization of all. My mother. Mom had been a shrewd woman, quiet but observant. She didn't miss much. About a year ago, she and I were having lunch, and she'd said, out of the blue, "Clara really leans on Mark, doesn't she?" I'd smiled. Yeah, she adores him. It's sweet. My mother had just stirred her iced tea, a thoughtful, almost troubled look on her face. Yes, she'd said slowly, not looking at me. Just make sure he remembers who his wife is. The comment had struck me as odd, almost shrewish, which was so unlike her. I'd brushed it off as a weird, momentary slip. A flicker of maternal jealousy. Oh God, it wasn't a slip. It was a warning. My mother saw it. She saw something, and she tried to tell me in the only way she knew how, a gentle nudge instead of a direct accusation. And I, her blind, trusting daughter, had completely missed it. The grief I felt for my mother was now tangled up with a new, profound wave of regret. I had failed to understand her. I had failed to protect myself. The sun had long set, and the house was utterly still. The cascade of memories had slowed to a trickle, leaving me hollowed out, exhausted, and yet horribly clear-headed. The hopeful part of me that had been desperately searching for an alternative explanation, a grief-induced hallucination, was dead. It wasn't one suspicious moment. It was a pattern. It was years of lingering touches, secret smiles, and shared jokes. It was a whole second story, a shadow life, running concurrently to my own. My marriage wasn't a fortress. It was a stage, and I had been the only one in the audience who didn't know the performance was a lie. I stood up on shaky legs and walked silently up the stairs. Mark was asleep in our bed, one arm flung over my side, claiming the space I was supposed to occupy. He looked peaceful, innocent. I stood in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, and felt nothing but a cold, desolate emptiness. He wasn't my husband. He was a stranger, and I was sleeping with the enemy. I didn't sleep. I lay beside Mark in the darkness, my body rigid, my eyes wide open, tracking the slow crawl of headlights across the ceiling. Every time he shifted in his sleep, every soft sigh that escaped his lips was a fresh wave of revulsion. He was a stranger, worse than a stranger. He was a landscape I thought I knew intimately, only to discover it was filled with hidden fault lines and poisonous wells. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I slipped out of bed, unable to bear another moment of the charade. I was in the kitchen, staring into a black cup of coffee, when he came downstairs. He was wearing his pajama pants and a t-shirt, his hair ruffled from sleep. He looked so normal, so much like the man I had loved for a decade, that it was physically disorienting. It was like seeing a monster perfectly disguised in human skin. "Hey!" he said softly, his voice thick with sleep. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You're up early." His touch was electric, and not in a good way. My entire body went stiff. I didn't pull away this time. I just froze, a statue in his embrace. He must have felt it, the complete lack of response, the sudden tension in my shoulders. He loosened his grip, stepping back. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with that carefully crafted concern I was beginning to recognize as his greatest weapon. I turned around slowly, leaning back against the counter. This was it. I hadn't planned it, but the question was a physical thing, lodged in my throat, demanding to be let out. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet kitchen. "Mark," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk about yesterday." He frowned, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Okay, talk away. Was it the service? Was it too much?" He was already directing the narrative, leading me down a path of grief and emotional fragility. I refused to take it. "No, it was about you and Clara." I kept my voice even, watching his face for any flicker, any tell. There was none. He was a professional. He took a sip of his coffee. "Clara? What about her? I thought she held up pretty well, all things considered." "The way you were with her," I said, the words feeling clumsy. "By the window, at the reception, it felt off." He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if I just said something completely absurd. "Off? Honey, what are you talking about? I was comforting your sister at your mother's funeral. I'm pretty sure that's what I was supposed to be doing." His tone was light, but there was a hard, dismissive edge to it. "It looked like more than comfort, Mark." I pushed, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. It looked intimate. That was the word. The trigger. He put his mug down on the counter with a definitive clink and turned to face me fully. His expression shifted from mild confusion to a deep, sorrowful pity. It was a look that said, "Oh, you poor, broken thing. Sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping to a low, therapeutic tone. "Listen to me. You are under an unimaginable amount of stress. Your mother, the woman who raised you, just died. You're exhausted. You're not sleeping. You're grieving. Your mind is going to play tricks on you. It's going to see things that aren't there. It's a textbook trauma response." Every word was a small, precise stab. He was using my grief, the most profound and painful experience of my life, as a shield. He was taking my love for my mother and twisting it into a diagnosis for my supposed insanity. "I know what I saw," I insisted, but my voice wavered. The sheer, unshakable confidence of his denial was a powerful force. For a terrifying second, a sliver of doubt crept in. Could he be right? Am I so broken by grief that I'm manufacturing conspiracies? He saw the flicker of uncertainty in my eyes and moved in for the kill. He took my hands in his. They were warm. Mine were ice cold. I was holding her arm because she was shaking. I was whispering to her because she told me she felt like she was going to faint and she didn't want to make a scene. Your sister was falling apart, and I was holding her together. For you. For your family. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering, full of manufactured sincerity. What you saw was me being a supportive brother-in-law and a supportive husband. Then he delivered the final, crushing blow. He squeezed my hands, his face a mask of wounded integrity. And I have to be honest, it hurts. It really, really hurts that in the middle of all this, you would think something so ugly about me. And about Clara, your own sister, that you would take a moment of family support and twist it into that. He let go of my hands and turned away, running a hand through his hair as if he were the one bearing an unbearable burden. He had done it. In the span of 2 minutes, he had flipped the entire script. He was no longer the accused, he was the victim. I was not the betrayed wife. I was the unstable, paranoid accuser, flinging baseless, hurtful allegations. I was the one who owed him an apology. I stood there, speechless. The memories from the night before, the pool party, the perfume, my mother's warning, rushed back, a silent chorus reminding me that I was not crazy. The image of his thumb stroking her arm was a photograph burned into my memory. That was not the gesture of a man preventing his sister-in-law from fainting. That was the touch of a lover. I knew he was lying, but I also knew I had lost this round. He was too skilled, too prepared. My grief was the perfect cover, and he was using it with surgical precision. To argue further would only make me seem more unhinged, more like the grieving, hysterical woman he was painting me to be. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, the words feeling like poison on my tongue. "I'm just tired." He turned back, his expression softening into one of magnanimous forgiveness. "Of course you are," he said, pulling me into a hug. I stood rigid in his arms, a block of ice. "We're going to get through this. I promise." I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of his shirt, the familiar smell now tainted with deceit. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully placated his hysterical, grieving wife. He had no idea what he had actually done. He hadn't just confirmed his guilt. He had declared war, and he had shown me exactly what kind of enemy he was. Clever, ruthless, and willing to use my deepest pain against me. The confrontation was over, but my investigation had just begun. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark treated me like a piece of fragile, antique glass. He spoke to me in soft, measured tones. He made all my favorite meals, which I could barely touch. He'd suggest we watch a movie, and then sit beside me on the couch, not touching, but radiating an aura of patient, benevolent care. It was a performance, and a damn good one. He was the loving husband, nursing his broken wife through her grief. To any outside observer, he was a saint. To me, he was a python, slowly suffocating me with his false kindness. I played my part, too. I was quiet, withdrawn, and melancholic. The perfect grieving widow's daughter. He thought my silence was sorrow. It was observation. I became a detective in my own home. I watched him constantly, cataloging his every move. I paid particular attention to his phone. It had become a third entity in our marriage, a sleek black rectangle that held all the secrets. He was careful with it, but not careful enough. He didn't know he was being watched. I noticed how he'd angle the screen away from me when he was texting. I noticed the quick, almost imperceptible smile that would touch his lips before he'd smooth his expression back into one of neutral concern. He was talking to her. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name, but I needed to see the words. I needed the proof that would incinerate his lies and my denial once and for all. My chance came on a Thursday night, 6 days after my mother's funeral. We'd just finished a silent dinner of lasagna, his attempt at comfort food. He announced he was going to take a long, hot shower to de-stress. He left his phone on the nightstand on his side of the bed, plugged into the charger. It was a common, everyday act, one I'd seen him do 1,000 times. But tonight, it felt like a gauntlet being thrown down. I waited until I heard the definitive sound of the water starting, a steady hiss from the ensuite bathroom. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. I walked into the bedroom, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The phone lay there, its screen dark. For a moment, I hesitated. This was a line I had never crossed in our 10 years together. I had always believed that privacy was sacred, even in a marriage. But his lies had desecrated everything sacred between us. There was no trust left to violate. My hand was shaking as I reached for the phone. Felt strangely heavy, like a weapon. I swiped the screen on. The lock screen appeared. A photo of the two of us on a trip to the coast, smiling, happy. The irony was a physical blow. I typed in his passcode, 1-2-1-8. Our wedding date. The sheer, cynical audacity of it made me want to scream. The phone unlocked. I took a deep breath and opened his text messages. My thumb scrolled through the list. There were messages from his colleagues, from his fantasy football league, from his mother. I saw Clara's name. My heart leaped into my throat. I tapped on it. The last few messages were from the day after the funeral. Thinking of you both today, she had written. Hope you're getting some rest. Mark's reply, thanks, Clara. Trying our best. You too. It was all so painfully normal. So plausible. The flicker of doubt, the one Mark had so expertly planted, returned with a vengeance. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe this is all in my head. But my gut screamed at me to keep looking. This was too clean, too perfect. This was the performance. The real conversation was happening somewhere else. I went back to his home screen, my eyes scanning the grid of apps. And then I saw it. Tucked away in a folder labeled Utilities between the calculator and the compass was the Instagram app. Mark didn't use Instagram. He'd always called it a narcissistic waste of time. I opened it. He was logged into an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was a generic landscape. There were no posts. He was following only one person. My blood ran cold. I knew who it would be. I clicked on the profile. It was Clara. Her account was private, but it didn't matter. They didn't need posts. They had the direct messages. I tapped the paper airplane icon in the top right corner. And there it was. A single conversation thread at the top of the list. Her name. Her smiling profile picture. My finger trembled as I opened it. The screen lit up with their secret world. It wasn't just flirting. It was a full-blown affair, documented in excruciating detail. I scrolled up, my vision blurring, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of their betrayal. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of messages stretching back for months. Pet names I had never heard him use. My sweet C. My handsome Mark. There were heart emojis, inside jokes, plans for secret meetups disguised as her needing help with a flat tire, or him having a late night at the office. He sent her photos of himself at his desk. She sent him selfies where she was biting her lip, her eyes sultry. They talked about everything. Their frustrations, their dreams, their future. Our future. Just a little while longer, he had written to her just last week. Once things settle with her mom, we can figure out a plan. I can't live this lie forever. The lie. I was the lie. My thumb kept scrolling upwards, a desperate, morbid need driving me back in time. I found the messages from the day my mother died. I had called him from the hospital, sobbing, telling him that she was gone. An hour later, he had messaged Clara. "It happened," he wrote. Her reply, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Is she okay? She meant me. She's a wreck," he'd written back. "This is going to be hard, but it's also our chance. Don't forget that." I felt the phone slip from my numb fingers, clattering onto the rug. Couldn't breathe. The air in the room was gone. My lungs were collapsing. They had used my mother's death. They had stood over the fresh grave of my grief and seen it as an opportunity. The sheer, monstrous selfishness of it was beyond comprehension. This wasn't just a betrayal of my marriage and my sisterhood. It was a desecration of my mother's memory. The sound of the shower turning off was a gunshot in the silence. I scrambled to pick up the phone, my hands clumsy and useless. With a final surge of adrenaline, I took a quick, shaky photo of the screen with my own phone, the messages from the day my mother died. Proof. I placed his phone back on the nightstand, exactly as it had been, and fled the room. I locked myself in the guest bathroom, sank to the cold tile floor, and finally, for the first time since my mother's heart stopped beating, I let out the silent scream that had been trapped inside me for days. There was no more doubt. There was no more hope. There was only the rubble of a life I no longer recognized and the cold, hard certainty of what I had to do next. Armed with the truth, I was a different woman. The grief for my mother was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but it was now encased in a hard, clear layer of ice. The shock was gone. The confusion was gone. All that remained was a singular, chilling purpose. Before I could confront Mark and detonate my entire life, I had to face my sister. I had to look her in the eye and make her answer for what she had done. I couldn't do it at my house, Mark's house. I couldn't do it at hers. I needed a place that belonged to us, a place that held the weight of the bond she had broken. I sent her a text. "Hey, I'm at Mom's place, starting to go through some of her clothes. Salat, could you come help me?" The irony was bitter on my tongue, using our dead mother as bait. But they had used her death as their opportunity, so it seemed only fitting. She replied almost instantly, "Of course, I'll be there in 20. Her fake sympathy dripped through the screen. I was waiting for her in the living room of the house we grew up in. The air was still and smelled faintly of Mom's rose-scented potpourri and old paper. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, slanting through the blinds, illuminating a lifetime of memories. Our family photos lined the mantelpiece. The two of us as gap-toothed kids in matching dresses, our high school graduations, family vacations. It was a museum of our sisterhood, and I was about to burn it to the ground. When Clara arrived, she came in carrying 2 coffees, her face arranged in an expression of gentle concern. "I figured you could use this," she said, holding one out to me. "How are you holding up?" I didn't take the coffee. I just looked at her, my sister, the other half of my childhood. Her face was so familiar, so intrinsically linked to my own, and yet I was looking at a complete stranger. "I know," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of emotion. It was colder and harder than I'd ever heard it before. Clara's smile faltered. "Know what? Honey, you're not making sense." "I know about you and Mark," I said, letting the words hang in the still, dusty air between us. Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly, her expression shifting to one of offended disbelief. It was a remarkable performance, almost as good as her lover's. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, letting out a little incredulous laugh. "Have you lost your mind? I think the grief is getting to you. Mark is my brother-in-law. He's been helping me just like he's been helping you. We're family." "Don't," I said, my voice dropping even lower. "Don't you dare stand there in our mother's house and gaslight me. I'm not the hysterical, grieving woman you and he seem to think I am. This is insane," she said, shaking her head. her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "You're twisting his kindness into something ugly. I can't believe this." "Kindness?" I asked. "Is that what you call it?" I took out my phone, my movements slow and deliberate. I opened the photo I had taken of Mark's screen and held it out for her to see. Her eyes flickered down to the phone. I watched her read the words. Their words. The messages from the day Mom died. "It's also our chance. Don't forget that." I watched the blood drain from her face. I watched the carefully constructed mask of innocence crumble into 1,000 pieces, revealing the panicked, guilty woman underneath. She had nowhere left to hide. She looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. But they weren't the tears of remorse I might have once hoped for. They were the tears of someone who had been caught. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Okay, but it wasn't what you think." "Oh, please," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. "Enlighten me. What was it?" And then came the excuses, a pathetic, desperate torrent of self-pity and blame. "It just happened," she started, "the oldest lie in the book. We never meant for it to. We would just talk and he listened to me. He really saw me." She took a shaky breath, and then she turned the knife. "He wasn't happy, you know," she said, her voice gaining a note of defiance, of justification. "You were always so focused on your career, and then with Mom getting sick, you pushed him away. He was lonely. He needed someone, and I was there." I stared at her, my sister, and felt a profound and bottomless emptiness. She had taken her betrayal and was trying to repackage it as my failure. In her twisted narrative, she was the heroine, the one who had provided the comfort and understanding that I, the cold, neglectful wife, had denied him. "So you swooped in to save my lonely husband?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Is that the story you tell yourself so you can sleep at night?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her voice rising to a childish whine. "We have a connection, something you and he, you haven't had that in years. You're more like roommates than husband and wife." Every word was a calculated cruelty, designed to wound, to justify. But it was too late for that. I was already dead inside. The woman she was trying to hurt was the naive fool who believed in her marriage and her sister. That woman was gone. I let her finish, let her spin her entire, sordid, pathetic tale. When she finally fell silent, sniffling, waiting for my tears, my anger, my forgiveness, anything, I just looked at her. "You stood by our mother's coffin," I said, my voice as flat and final as a tombstone. "You accepted sympathy from her friends. And all the while, you were thinking about how her death was your chance to steal my life. It wasn't just that you slept with my husband, Clara. It's that you danced on our mother's grave to do it." I saw the last flicker of hope die in her eyes. She finally understood that there was no coming back from this. "You are nothing to me now," I said. "The sister I grew up with, the one in all these pictures, she's gone. As far as I'm concerned, she died right alongside Mom." I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. I could hear her start to sob behind me, a messy, pleading sound. "Wait, please, don't do this." I didn't stop. I walked out of my childhood home and closed the door on its ghosts. The bond between us, once the strongest thing in my life, was now just another body in the wreckage. I was alone, but for the first time in days I could breathe. The lies were dead, and I was finally free. I drove home from my mother's house in a state of preternatural calm. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a landscape of stark, crystalline clarity. There were no more tears to cry, no more questions to ask. There was only the truth, a hard and heavy object I now carried. My sister was a ghost. My marriage was a fraud. My husband was my enemy. When I walked into my house, it was with the steady, measured gait of a soldier entering a battlefield she knew she was about to win. I didn't bother to hide my intentions. I went to the bar cart in the living room and poured myself 2 fingers of the expensive whiskey Mark saved for special occasions. The fiery liquid slid down my throat, a welcome burn. I sat on the couch, the one we'd picked out together, and waited. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, each tick a countdown to detonation. Mark came home an hour later, whistling. The cheerful sound died in his throat the moment he saw me. He stopped in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, taking in the scene, me, sitting perfectly still on the couch in the dimming light, a glass of his best whiskey in my hand, my expression utterly blank. The performance was over, and he knew it. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Tough day." "You could say that," I replied, my voice even. I took a slow sip of my drink. "I went to Mom's house today," a flicker of panic in his eyes. He was already calculating, running through scenarios. "Oh, yeah. How was that?" He set his briefcase down, starting to unbutton his cuffs, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. "Enlightening," I said. "Clara met me there. We had a long talk." His hands stilled. He looked at me, his face a mask of carefully controlled neutrality, but I could see the frantic machinations behind his eyes. He was caught, and he was trying to figure out which lie to tell. "Clara?" he said, forcing a small, confused laugh. "What did she have to say?" "She told me everything," I said. "But then I already knew, didn't I? I just needed her to confirm it." I picked up my phone from the cushion beside me and turned the screen toward him. The picture of his messages to my sister was bright in the darkening room. His words, her name, the proof. He stared at the screen, and for the first time the mask shattered completely. His face, stripped of its charm and false concern, was ugly. It was the face of a cornered rat. "You went through my phone," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You actually went through my private messages. What the hell is wrong with you?" It was a stunning, audacious move, to be caught in such a profound betrayal and to make my discovery the crime. I almost laughed. "What's wrong with me?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "You want to stand there, in the house I own, and ask me what's wrong with me? It's a violation of privacy. It's insane," he sputtered, taking a step forward. "No," I said, standing up to meet his gaze. The top of my head barely came to his chin, but in that moment, I felt like a giant. "Insane is screwing my sister while our mother is dying. Insane is using my grief as a cover story for your sordid little affair. Insane is thinking I was so stupid, so broken, that I would never figure it out. It wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice finally breaking free of its controlled tenor. "You have no idea what it was like. You checked out of this marriage years ago. You were never here. You were always working, always busy, always somewhere else. I was lonely." The excuses were identical to Clara's, a script they had clearly rehearsed together, the anthem of the adulterer. "Lonely?" I shot back, my own voice rising, fueled by a year of suppressed anger and a week of unimaginable pain. "Don't you dare talk to me about being lonely. I was the one holding my mother's hand while her heart gave out. I was the one picking out her casket. Where were you, Mark? Were you lonely then? Or were you too busy texting my sister about what a great chance this was for you both?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face contorting with rage and shame. "That's not fair. You're twisting everything." "Am I?" I stalked toward him, my fury a living thing. "Then let's untwist it. How long, Mark? How long has this been going on behind my back?" He just shook his head, backing away. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and ragged. "Was it a month? 6 months? A year?" He finally broke, shouting back at me. "A year. Okay. A little over a year. Are you happy now? A year. A whole year of my life had been a lie. Every 'I love you,' every anniversary dinner, every shared moment had been tainted. Happy? No, I'm not happy. I'm just getting started." "Where? In her apartment? In hotels? In our car?" The questions poured out of me, each one a new layer of hell I needed to visit. "Stop it!" he yelled, throwing his hands up. "In our bed, Mark?" I whispered the final, most vile question. "Did you bring her into our bed?" He He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. And in his silence, I got my answer. The whiskey glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the hardwood floor, a punctuation mark to the end of our world. The sound shocked us both into silence. We stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by the wreckage of our marriage, the air thick with the stench of his lies and my pain. I looked at him, this pathetic, cheating, lying man, and the fire of my rage finally burned out, leaving behind nothing but cold, gray ash. There was no love left. There wasn't even any hate. There was just nothing. I walked past him, avoiding the glittering shards of glass on the floor. I went to the hall closet and pulled out an empty suitcase. I threw it on the floor at his feet. "What's this?" he asked, his voice now quiet, defeated. "It's a suitcase," I said, my voice utterly calm. "Pack your things. I want you out of my house. Tonight." He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that the game was truly over. "You can't be serious. I have never," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "been more serious in my entire life. Get out." He didn't leave immediately. For a moment, he just stared at the suitcase at his feet as if it were a bomb. Then came a last, desperate flurry of resistance. He tried pleading, "Don't do this, we can fix this, we can go to therapy." He tried anger, "You're throwing away 10 years over one mistake." And he tried guilt, "Where am I supposed to go at this hour?" I was a stone wall. None of it touched me. My heart, which he had so thoroughly pulverized, was no longer capable of feeling the vibrations of his manipulation. "I imagine you'll go to her," I said, my voice flat. That single sentence seemed to finally break his spirit. He knew there was nothing left to say. The next hour was a surreal, disjointed ballet of a marriage ending. I sat on the stairs, watching, as he moved through the house that was no longer his. The sounds were stark in the tense quiet. The scrape of hangers in the closet, the angry zipping of the suitcase, the thud of drawers being slammed shut. He moved with a frantic, resentful energy, snatching his things as if I might suddenly change my mind and demand he leave them behind. He didn't look at me. When the suitcase was finally full, he dragged it to the front door. His keys came out of his pocket and were placed on the small entryway table with a soft, metallic clink. It was a sound of absolute finality. He opened the door, looked back at me one last time with eyes full of a pathetic mixture of rage and self-pity, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the deadbolt turned with a heavy, echoing thud. And then there was silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever experienced. It was deeper than the quiet of an empty house. It was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked all the air and noise out of the world. The ticking of the clock seemed to have stopped. My own breathing was deafening. The silence was the sound of a decade of my life ending. It was the sound of my future being erased. After a long time, I stood up on shaky legs. I walked into the living room, my bare feet crunching on the shards of the whiskey glass. The first act of my new life. I went to the kitchen, retrieved a dustpan and brush, and methodically swept every last glittering splinter of glass into a neat pile. I dumped it into the trash with a satisfying crash. One mess cleaned up, a million more to go. I began to wander through the rooms, my home, which now felt like a pristine, hollowed-out museum of a dead relationship. In the kitchen, the 2 coffee mugs from our first, failed confrontation were still sitting by the sink. I took the one with the logo of his favorite baseball team, and dropped it into the trash can with the glass. In the den, the leather armchair I'd sat in, while my world unraveled, seemed to hold the imprint of my despair. The hardest part was the bedroom. Our bedroom, now my bedroom. A gaping void in the closet showed where his suits and shirts had hung just an hour before. His side of the bed was empty. I could still smell him on the pillow, a faint, familiar scent of his soap and his skin that now turned my stomach. This was where the full weight of it all finally crashed down on me. It wasn't him I was mourning. The man I'd kicked out was a stranger, a cruel imposter. I was mourning the man I thought I'd married. I was mourning the 10 years I had invested, the laughter we had shared, the future we were supposed to build. I was grieving for the children we never had, for the vows we had broken, for the naive girl who had walked down the aisle, so full of love and hope. And underneath it all was the raw, open wound of my other losses. My mother was gone. My sister was a traitor. My husband was a liar. In the span of a week, the 3 central pillars of my life had been demolished. I was utterly, completely alone. I crawled into the center of the bed, pulled the duvet over my head, and finally allowed myself to shatter. The sobs were silent, violent things that shook my entire body, a primal outpouring of a grief so profound it had no sound. It was the grief of total annihilation. I don't know how long I cried, but eventually, the storm passed, leaving behind a strange and barren calm. I was empty, hollowed out, lying there in the dark, in the center of my big, empty bed. A single, simple thought rose up from the wreckage. It's over. It wasn't a thought of despair. It was a statement of fact. And with that fact came a strange, unexpected flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, but resolve. The decision was no longer a reaction. A command screamed in the heat of a fight. It was a choice, made in the cold, quiet aftermath. I was going to divorce him. I was going to sell this house full of ghosts. I was going to build something new from the rubble, something that was entirely my own. The pain was an ocean and I was adrift, but for the first time I felt like I could at least choose which way to swim. I got out of bed, my movements no longer shaky, but deliberate. I stripped the sheets, the duvet cover, the pillowcases, everything that held his scent, and carried the bundle to the laundry room. I then walked back to the living room, to the mantelpiece crowded with smiling photographs. My eyes landed on our wedding portrait, the image of 2 happy, hopeful people who no longer existed. I picked it up, walked to the trash can, and placed it gently on top of the broken glass and the discarded coffee mug. In its place on the mantel, I put a small, simple photo of my mother, smiling on her last birthday. Her house was no longer my home, but she would have a place in mine. The silence in the house was still profound, but it wasn't a vacuum anymore. It was just quiet. It was the sound of a beginning. For a few days, my secret was my own. The quiet, empty house was a sanctuary where I could begin the long, arduous process of untangling my life without an audience. I hired a divorce lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who made me feel, for the first time, like I was taking a step forward instead of just surveying the damage. But I knew the silence couldn't last. My family, already reeling from my mother's death, was about to be hit by a powerful aftershock, and it was my duty to warn them. The first person I had to tell was my father. I found him in his workshop in the garage, the place he always went to think. The air smelled of sawdust and old coffee. He was sanding a piece of wood, his movements slow and tired. The grief for my mother had aged him 10 years in a week. My heart ached for the new pain I was about to cause him. "Dad," I said softly from the doorway. He looked up, his eyes weary, and tried to give me a smile. "Hey, kiddo, come on in." I walked over to the workbench, my hands trembling slightly. There was no easy way to do this, no gentle way to deliver a blow like this. So I just said it, the words stark and brutal in the quiet workshop. "Dad, Mark and I are getting a divorce." He stopped sanding, his hand freezing in midair. He stared at me, his brow furrowed with confusion and concern. "What? Why? Did you two have a fight? Honey, you're both under so much stress right now." "It's not the stress, Dad," I said, cutting him off before he could build a narrative that wasn't true. I had to give him the whole ugly truth. He had an affair. The color drained from his face. My father was a man of simple, solid principles. Loyalty was everything to him. Adultery was the ultimate sin. "That son of a bitch," he breathed, his voice a low growl of disbelief and fury. "There's more," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. I had to force the next words out. "It was with Clara." He recoiled as if I had physically struck him. He sank down onto a nearby stool, the piece of wood forgotten in his hand. He looked at me, then looked away, as if the reality was too painful to behold. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. He was a man who had just lost his wife of 40 years. Now he was learning that his family, the legacy they had built together, was a snake pit. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were full of a profound, bottomless sorrow that mirrored my own. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry." He didn't question me. He didn't doubt me. In that moment, he was simply my father, and his loyalty was absolute. He was my first and most important ally. As we knew it would, the news spread through the family like a virus. My father told his sister, my Aunt Carol, and from there, the phone lines lit up. The family, which should have been a unified front of comfort in our shared grief for my mother, fractured into jagged, warring pieces. Aunt Carol, who had always been my mother's closest confidant, was firmly in my corner. "I never liked him," she declared over the phone, her voice fierce with protective rage. "He always had shifty eyes. And Clara, well, that girl has always been selfish, bless her heart." Her validation was a balm on my raw nerves. A few cousins reached out with messages of love and support, creating a small, strong circle around my father and me. But the support was far from universal. Many relatives retreated into a cowardly, uncomfortable neutrality. "We don't want to take sides," my Uncle Robert said, his voice awkward over the phone. "This is a private family matter." His refusal to condemn what had happened felt like a tacit endorsement, a betrayal in its own right. They didn't want the mess. They wanted to grieve my mother in peace, and the ugly drama of my imploding marriage was an inconvenience. Worse, however, were the ones who subtly or not so subtly took their side. My great-aunt Millie, a woman from a generation that believed a wife's job was to keep her husband happy at all costs, called to offer her advice. "Are you sure you were paying enough attention to him, dear?" she'd asked. "Men have needs, and with you so upset about your mother." I hung up on her. Through the family grapevine, I heard the narrative Mark and Clara were spinning. It was a masterpiece of self-pitying delusion. They hadn't done anything wrong. They had simply fallen in love. It was a tragic, beautiful, unstoppable force. They painted me as a cold, career-obsessed, and ultimately neglectful wife who had created the void they were destined to fill. They were the star-crossed lovers. I was the villain. Hearing it was infuriating, but it was also clarifying. Their ability to twist reality to suit their own selfishness was proof that they were truly lost. The fallout forced me to draw lines in the sand. When a cousin called to tell me she'd spoken to Clara and that I should try to find it in my heart to forgive, I cut her off. "My heart isn't a part of this conversation right now," I told her, my voice cold. "You can support me, or you can support her, but you can't do both." The process was excruciating. Every phone call was a potential landmine. My mother's death had already redefined our family, and now this betrayal was redrawing the map entirely. The family I had grown up with was gone. In its place was something smaller, more fractured, but also more honest. A few nights later, I was back at my father's house, helping him sort through some of Mom's old photo albums. We worked in comfortable silence, the quiet between us full of a shared understanding. "We were the survivors, you know," he said, tapping a photo of a young me and a young Clara building a sandcastle. "Your mother always worried about Clara. She loved her to pieces, but she worried she didn't have a strong moral compass." He sighed, a heavy, rattling sound. "I guess a mother always knows." We looked at the picture of two smiling, innocent girls a lifetime ago. The family in that photograph was gone forever. But sitting here, next to my father, I knew I wasn't entirely alone. The wreckage was vast, but on a small, newly formed island, the two of us were starting to rebuild. The seasons turned, pulling me along with them. The raw, gaping wound of that first week slowly began to scar over. Winter's bleakness gave way to the tentative green shoots of spring, and with it, the first stirrings of a new life I hadn't asked for but was now forced to build. The divorce was a slow, ugly crawl through a swamp of legal paperwork. I sold the house, our house, and used my half of the money to buy a small, bright apartment in a part of the city I'd always loved. It had a little balcony big enough for a chair and a few pots of herbs. It was mine, every single inch of it. Mark and Clara were together. I knew this from the pained, sporadic updates from my father. They had moved into a new apartment across town, attempting to build a life on a foundation of lies and broken hearts. The thought of them no longer sent a jolt of white-hot rage through me. Now it was more like a dull, distant ache, the phantom pain of a severed limb. The last task of my old life was to clear out my mother's house. My father couldn't bring himself to do it, so I volunteered, seeing it as a final, necessary act of closure. For a week, I spent my days in that quiet, ghost-filled space, sorting a lifetime of belongings into 3 piles: keep, donate, and throw away. It was a profoundly sad task, but also a meditative one. I was not just packing up my mother's life, but my entire past. On the final day, I was in her bedroom, clearing out the small, cherrywood desk where she used to write letters and pay bills. The drawers were filled with the mundane artifacts of a life. Old checkbooks, warranties for appliances long gone, a tangle of paperclips and stamps. In the very back of the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old stationery, was a small, cloth-bound journal. It wasn't a diary. My mother was too private for that. I opened it. Most of the pages were blank. But on the very first page, in her familiar, elegant cursive, was an entry. It was dated the week after my wedding 10 years ago. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was just her thoughts, a single page of them. "My daughter is a wife now," she had written. "I look at her, and I see so much of myself, and so much of my own mother. We are a line of strong women, though I pray she never has to find out just how strong she is. I see the way she looks at her new husband, with a love that is so total, so trusting. It is a beautiful thing. It is a terrifying thing. A woman's heart is a powerful and resilient vessel, but it should never be the only home she has. My greatest wish for her is not just a happy marriage, but a happy life, a life that is fundamentally her own. May she always remember that her own 2 hands are the only ones that can ever truly build her a place of shelter. May her happiness be a house she builds herself, on foundations that no man can ever shake." I read the words once, twice, 3 times, the paper trembling in my hands. The tears that came were not tears of sorrow, but of a strange and powerful gratitude. It was a message from the past, a voice from beyond the grave, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. She had seen the potential vulnerability in my all-consuming love. She had worried about me, not because she suspected Mark, but because she knew the world, and she knew that a woman's strength had to be her own. She hadn't wanted me to find out how strong I was, but I had, and I had survived. The betrayal, the divorce, the family schism, they had been an earthquake that had leveled the life I was living in. But my foundation, the one my mother had wished for me, was still there. It was shaken, but it wasn't broken. I carefully tore the page from the journal and folded it, placing it in my wallet. It was the most valuable thing she had left me. I closed the last box, a mix of old photos and small keepsakes. I took one final walk through the empty rooms of my childhood home, the afternoon light casting long shadows on the bare floors. I wasn't leaving a ruin. I was leaving the past behind. As I locked the front door for the very last time, I felt the weight of my mother's legacy settle on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of strength. The house of my happiness was still under construction, but for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I had the blueprints, and I had the strongest hands to build it with my own. The story I've just shared with you is not an easy one to tell. It's a story born from the worst week of my life, a period of time where the ground beneath my feet simply crumbled away, leaving a chasm of grief and betrayal. The scars from that time are still with me. They are a part of my landscape now, faint white lines on my heart that remind me of how much it's been through. But I've learned that scars are not just a testament to the wound, but a testament to the healing. They are proof that we can be broken and still somehow become whole again. My life is quieter now, simpler. I find joy in the little things. The taste of the fresh basil I grow on my balcony, the warmth of the morning sun on my face, the laughter of old friends who circled the wagons and refused to let me fall. I am building my own house, just as my mother wished. It's a small house, and the work is slow, but the foundation is solid, and the walls are built with a strength I never knew I possessed. Sharing this story is part of that rebuilding, because I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that I am not the only one who has ever stood in the wreckage of a life they thought was secure. Betrayal is a universal language, and its pain is a profoundly isolating experience. It makes you feel like you are the only person in the world drowning in that particular sea of sorrow. But telling our stories is how we find the shore, is how we find each other. If any part of my story resonated with you, if it made you feel understood, or seen, or a little less alone in your own struggle, I would be so grateful if you would let me know by giving this video a like. And if you believe, as I do, that there is power in these stories of survival, in finding the flicker of light after the profound darkness, then please consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many stories yet to tell, and so much strength to be found in the telling. Thank you for listening, and for holding this piece of my heart with me today.